Hello, everyone, and welcome back to What We Can't Not Talk About, the podcast of the Austin Institute for the Study of Family and Culture. So, first of all, since you're here, let me start by saying that I really hope you already watched our latest episodes, the one on the dignity of dependence with Leah Libresco, and the one on Ivy League miseducation with the three scholars that co-authored that very interesting book. And I say very interesting, especially for the parents that are listening and are thinking whether they should be spending a lot of money for their kids to attend one of these Ivy League institutions. So if you have not, I really encourage you to listen to those episodes. And so once you're done with today's episode, which is going to be amazing, I'm sure, look for those. And if you don't have time, just save them in your queue. So coming to today, I will say that I'm very, very happy to welcome back on our show a professor who visited us in Austin in person and who has also been very generous with his time with our groups. He met with our professionals to discuss his previous book, and they all remember that meeting very much. And we're honored to have a more private and informal conversation with him. With me today is Dr. Carl Trueman, professor of biblical and theological studies at Grove City College and fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon, Carl, and welcome on our show.
It's great to be back, Mariana. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining us. I hear you're in South Bend.
I am. I'm on loan to the University of Notre Dame for the year, so been hanging around with you Catholics for this academic period.
Right. We're still waiting for that to happen. Never say never. But and we started already with religious talk here, and this is I think this is appropriate considering the title of your new book. So when we last talked, we were talking about Strange New World, which was your previous book, and was, if you allow me to say that, a simplified or summarized version of your opus, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. And now you're publishing this new volume, The Desecration of Man: How the Rejection of God Desecrates Our Humanity. So that's why I say, the religious question, I think, is going to be very central. But let me start by asking you this. If you should say, like you wrote Strange New World, what was it, 4 years ago? 3?
Yes, something like that. Yeah.
4. Okay. So what is the main thing that changed either outside of you or in the way you look at things between one book or another? If you could point to
Yeah, I think the latest book is asking a slightly different question. The self book and then the sort of summarized version, Strange New World, was really wrestling with the question of how do we get here? Specifically, the question of why the statement "I am a woman trapped in a man's body" had come to make sense. My grandfather would have regarded that as ridiculous. He wouldn't have had the conceptual vocabulary to even know what was being said. And yet we live in a world now where such a statement, we may disagree with it, but we know what's being communicated. So I was really interested in finding out what had gone on in the wider culture to reshape the minds, not just of gender theorists, but of ordinary men and women in the street on that question. This book, The Desecration of Man, is, again, I'm wrestling with why certain phrases, if you like, have come to have common currency. And if I were to zero in on a single phrase or pair of phrases, it would be the question of why is it that, in the 1990s, abortion was to be safe, legal, and rare. And in the 2024 election in the United States, it was being proclaimed as a basic human right, and it was something to be proud of and to brag about if you'd had an abortion. And that raised the question for me of what's gone on in society, that we've moved from seeing something as, if you like, a necessary but unfortunate evil to something that needs to be celebrated. And that took me to very popular terminology at the moment is that the world is disenchanted. That's one way of looking at it. And that captures a lot of modernity, but it didn't seem to me to explain quite what was going on there. That the first statement, safe, legal, and rare, is I would say, a disenchanted statement. There's a certain unfortunate resignation there. But when you start exulting in these things, something more is going on. And that's where I became convinced that desecration captures things more accurately, because to desecrate something is exhilarating. It gives a sense of power. And it seems to me that what's going on in our culture at the moment is the trampling on things once considered holy that gives us a buzz, that makes us feel powerful, that makes us feel like gods. So it's not that my thinking's changed, it's just that I've moved into a different area and wrestling with a slightly different problem.
You speak of rejection of God, and that made me think, like only, what is it, 60? No, 80 years ago. And I say only because 80 years is not a long time. Anyone who has lived 50 or 60 knows that very well. Um, there was a famous essay by an Italian philosopher, Benedetto Croce, that was, why we cannot help calling ourselves Christians. Similarly, everyone was taking for granted that even if we are atheists and we proclaim ourselves atheists in the West, we're still Christians. Our culture is so um, permeated by all the Christian values, our idea of human freedom, our idea of rights, our idea of dignity. So, not to disagree with you, but actually to agree with you that this is exactly right. This is exactly what happened. Is that did something new happen after 1942 when Benedetto Croce wrote this, or another model I had in the past, an Italian journalist would call herself a Christian atheist, Oriana Fallaci, while she was defending the West and its values. So did something particularly happen after 1942, or is this simply the manifestation of something that has roots in a more distant past?
Yeah, well, certainly one could say it has roots in the distant past. But I think you're right in highlighting the 1940s as something of a watershed. I would point to, for example, the development of the atom bomb.
Mm.
Jean-Paul Sartre, a French philosopher, made the comment that, after the atom bomb, every generation would be different, because now human beings, for the first time ever, had to decide to continue to exist. We actually have the power now to wipe ourselves out that we've never had before. So the development of the A-bomb, I think, was very significant. We've seen technology advancing fast on a whole heap of fronts. And what that does is it makes desecration imaginable in a way that it wasn't before. Uh, think about sexual morality, for example. In the 19th century, you could certainly think about transgressing the sexual mores of the day. You could think about defying Christian teaching, but that was a very expensive thing to do. You could catch a very nasty, incurable disease. If you're a man, you could get a woman pregnant, and that would have consequences for you. If you're a woman, you could get pregnant, and that would have consequences for you. So it was impossible to imagine a world where one could easily transgress in the West Christian sexual mores. They were reinforced by the social, cultural, material conditions of life. Once you have antibiotics and easy access, say, to abortion, it becomes easier to imagine that the sacred rules surrounding sex are not actually that sacred at all. And it becomes easy to imagine that the way to assert yourself as authentic and as free thinking, as in as independent, is to transgress those values that were considered sacred by previous generation. Now, you mentioned Benedetto Croce, of course, Augusto Del Noce, another Italian philosopher. He spots this in the 1960s. He sees the sexual revolution as having profound metaphysical implications, but also sees it as being enabled by the kind of technology we have available. Jump to the present, we could expand it well beyond sexual morality. Say that, typically we have regarded human beings as limited by our bodies. Our bodies are mortal. Our bodies are finite. Well, now we have technology that allows us to think that, well, we could live forever, technology that allows us to think we can enhance our strength to the nth degree. Technology is even allowing us to think that the natural limits, natural ends, are problems that prevent us from truly realizing who we could be. And we have the technology that allows us to deliver on those things.
So yeah, and thank you for mentioning another great Italian Del Noce that we discussed on this show with Lancelotti that curated all the translations in English. Um, there are a lot of, directions that our conversations could take, but what I would like for our audience to better understand, because, I'm privileged, I did read your book, so I might know a little bit more, but to introduce people who might also not be familiar with what you wrote in the past from the anthropology that we're maybe taking for granted. When you say that disenchantment is not enough to understand where we're at, we need to think about desecration. This makes me think of when you think about Nietzsche and the fact that we killed God, right? And the madman.
Yeah.
So, how would you describe the way in which it's playing out in today's life? Like, how is a regular person not living a consecrated life? Like a sacred, the sacredness of his life or of his body.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good question. I think we go back to Nietzsche. Nietzsche's, a key passage in Nietzsche is the so-called parable of the madman in the gay science. And for listeners who are not familiar with that, Nietzsche tells this story of a madman who rushes into a town square in the middle of the day. He's clearly a lunatic because he has a lamp, even though it's daylight. And he berates the atheists who are standing around. He shouts at them, "God is dead," and they all laugh at him. And the madman says, "No, no, you don't understand. He's dead because we have killed him." And they still laugh at him. They don't understand. And the madman says, "No, no, no. You don't realize you can't just." I'm paraphrasing here, but essentially he says, "You can't just kill God and then carry on as if nothing has changed. If you kill God, you must rise up to be gods yourself. You have to provide your own lives with meaning. You have to create your own systems of values. You have to be gods." And the madman gives the impression that that's both a terrifying thing because it brings a huge responsibility to bear upon us. On the other hand, it's also an exhilarating thing. It makes us feel like gods. There's nothing more exhilarating than having the blood of God on your own hands. Now, how does that play out in the current day? I think when you think about the subjectivity of values, this idea that we're all allowed to invent our own values. We're all allowed to think of the meaning of our own lives in our own way. That we see communal corporate responsibilities as hindrances to who we are. We take a delight in smashing through boundaries imposed upon us. I might say, think about literature, think about how the anti-hero has emerged as the new hero. Think about television. Think about the rise of reality TV. Well, reality TV, by and large, Mariana, doesn't focus on people like you and me, people who live boring, polite lives and go about working and treating other people with respect. Reality TV presents as heroes those who treat other people badly. It lionizes bad behavior. So I would say desecration plays out in all of these areas. And from a Christian perspective, I would perhaps summarize it in this way and say, what is the Christian teaching of what it means to be human? We're persons. We're free beings with a moral structure. And one of the things we're required to do is to treat other beings made in the image of God as persons. Where does desecration then most obviously manifest itself? In my tendency to treat other persons as things, for me to treat you as merely instrumental to me feeling good, rather than seeing you as an end in yourself. So desecration really plays out in the way we treat other human beings. And in the book, I look at three aspects of modernity and ask the question, do these revolutions lead to us treating other people or as things? I look at sex, reproduction, and how we think of death. And in each area, I come to the conclusion the promise is this will liberate us. The reality is it reduces human beings to things of mere instrumental significance.
Yeah. And for anyone who wants to, I mean, nobody could tell us, that we found a causal relation. But in this time of this insane amount of freedom, and when we are consider the others are instrumental to our own happiness, the amount of people taking antidepressants has never been this high, right? People
Yeah.
that are otherwise very healthy and like so. In somehow, clearly, I would say things are not going well. And there's one thing that is very beautiful in having a God that is uh, immortal and loving, and it's if we instead become gods with all our vices and limits, um, it sounds like a dreadful path to take. But so you do discuss the desecration as showing up in in the abortion thing, in sex and pornography, and our pornified culture, and in that I was wondering, since I'm assuming that desecration would play out in every area of life, I was thinking of how this has or might have affected learning and knowledge because and the thought that I have here was that if everything is impermanent and changes based on how I feel, say what the reason why I was always doing was why do we study history, right? Well, because the mistakes of the past, and like we know where
Yeah.
we come from, we try not to do that again, we understand how human beings behave. Same thing with every discipline, right? Like we do believe that there is something to be learned. But if men are just things and they can change and enhance themselves, could this be the reason why we don't? And I say we, but like I am feeling like a lack of interest that is growing towards learning and even especially probably learning from the past. Do you think that this might be something?
Yes, I think you're onto something there, Marianne. I mean, I think we need to divide. If you look at university or colleges, we need to divide learning into various subcategories. But clearly, one of the primary reasons people go into education today is to learn skills that will enable them to sell themselves in the marketplace. Now, that's not a bad thing in itself, but to reduce education to that, I think, is somewhat dehumanizing. On the other hand, you have the humanities, and the humanities have come to be dominated by a variety of approaches that we sort of gather together under the term critical theory. And critical theory is really predicated on this idea that human relations are to be understood in terms of zero-sum power games, and that what it means to be human requires us to understand how I am manipulating you, or my group is manipulating your group at any given point in time. So there's an anti-humanism, one could put it that way, that lies at the heart, ironically, of the humanities, which are meant to be the disciplines that humanize us. Now, I'd want to say, certainly, if I was teaching a class on Dostoevsky, for example, I'd want to draw out some of the class interests that underlie his writings. But that would only be one facet of what I was doing. My primary interest in Dostoevsky would be to wrestle with how is he addressing the fundamental questions of human existence? What do I share in common with him that means I can learn from the dramas that he sets forth and enhance my own humanity and enhance my own relationship with my peers at this point in time? So that a deeply reductive suspicion of any concept of human nature, I think, has come to grip education and the educational process. I had a great pleasure this semester of teaching a course, The Abolition of Man,
Hmm.
starting with the C.S. Lewis book, but going all the way up to the writings of Mary Harrington in the present day. And it was not for credit, and it was a straight pass-fail. And what was beautiful in my experience was it was 19, 20 students who were just there to discuss big ideas. There was no instrumentality in the course beyond that. And I was left thinking, in some ways, that's what education should be,
Yeah.
rather than the having to tick the boxes in order to be a marketable commodity in the job market.
Completely agreed. You know, like what we do at the Austinist is always not for credit. And like we are hoping that, younger generations crave for answers and meaning and they want to look for it. It's just that in order for even knowing that you have a need, you need to be, somehow made aware that there might be some answers out there. And I was even noticing how with less time and less time spent, reading an actual book, even ending up reading Dostoevsky and understanding that there might be something there, it's like the occasions become rarer and rarer. Now, because we talk about desecration and, we're talking about consecrating ourselves again and understanding morality, I think, right? Because we could say, I know that you were asked this question on trigonometry, if we can have a moral state without God, right? Um, and yeah, I think you gave a great answer there. But what I would like to say, and to you know to tell our audience is that you are probably the farthest from someone who would preach Christian nationalism, and you make it very clear. And I maybe that's one of the main reason I adore your book. As a Christian, faith is a very private choice and it's a gift, and like, but I would also think that's only Christianity taught us that, right? That you can't force it upon others. And you do talk about this re-enchantment, how it can go wrong somehow, right? Presenting in particular Roger Scruton, I think, was an interesting example of that thing. I don't know if Dawkins would also be the same. But so talking about this, right? So why does this consecration not require, it's you're not envisioning a Christian theocracy, right? Yeah, I know, I know.
No,
Okay,
not
so
at all.
let's explain it to the ones who are wondering.
Yeah, well, my ultimate answer to desecration is consecration. And that, of course, then raises the question of so where are human beings consecrated? And my answer, as yours, Mariana, would be we're consecrated in the church. You can't legislate consecration. Uh, Congress cannot consecrate the United States by passing a law. The Supreme Court can't do that by applying the Constitution. It has to start in some ways at the local level, where Christians gather and hear God's word being proclaimed, who engage in worship of God through a liturgy that's properly shaped by the message being preached, by the actions of God in Christ, and then by engaging in living as Christians in their communities. And I use the example of hospitality, particularly in the book, because I say, what is it that makes where do I treat other human beings truly as human beings? It's when I freely open my house to them and I have them round for food and a time of friendship and conversation. When I treat them in that way as human beings, they become truly human to me and they feel truly human. Uh, so my answer is a very ecclesiastical one on one level, and it's a very local one. Uh, some may see that as a rather low energy approach to it, but I say it may be low energy, but I think it's the only one we've really got. And one of the problems of modernity is we do want everything done by this time next Wednesday. And I think we have to reconfigure our thinking. Think, we're in this for the long game. The things I do today, I'm doing so that when my granddaughter grows up, there'll be a light for her to be guided by. Having said
Yeah.
that, I don't want to divorce Christians completely from the public square. I was speaking a few years ago to a gathering of Muslims, and the last question was, so where do you find hope? And I was expecting this question, so I said to them, okay, I see hope in three areas. I said, the first two you'll agree with me on. I'm going to lose you in the third one. The third one, of course, was going to be the church, Jesus. But the first two are one, we don't have to allow our own homes to be places of bitterness, anger, and
Mm.
cynicism. We don't have to allow our own houses to be havens for the worst aspects of the world around us. That's down to us. We can have homes that are not only beautiful to look at, but beautiful to be in because of the attitudes expressed there. And secondly, we can stand shoulder to shoulder with human beings who they may not be Christians, but they still have some intuitive grasp of what it means to be truly human. And I would say, it doesn't matter to me in some ways whether my neighbors are Christian or not. We all want the streets to be safe to walk at night. We all want our neighborhoods to be safe, clean, happy environments. We want to see Congress passing laws that are good and that protect the weak and punish wrongdoers. So I would say there is a place for Christians, consecrated Christians, to have an influence in the public square. It's just that we can't legislate consecration.
Couldn't agree more. And, one example that I think you give in your book that speaks to, we are not a religious institution. You know me, so you can say you Catholics, but like we are a lay organization, and I like to think that we're a place for any student who wants to have the bigger questions answered. And one way you do it, speaking of marriage, at some point in talking about sex and the culture that we live in. Um, and I wish I'd read certain things when I was 18 and not later in life. But it was about, when we talk about marriage, we know that we're not considering the other as an object, because you don't want to marry, if you're in love with someone and you walk to the altar, and then the person there is another one, even if she looks the same, or like, but it's not the same. And he said, because you're not marrying a woman, and you're marrying the woman.
Yes. Yeah.
So in that sense, I think that anyone understands it, right? Like, so
Yeah.
there are, in this move towards consecration, those of us who have had the gift of, having faith and like knowing that can show a way, but the way that you show does not require um having accepted, also the existence of that particular God in that, with that particular creed. Now, that said, when you talk of Christianity, though, you make it very clear that we cannot have cult or code without creed. And I found that passage also like incredibly important in today's world, where we seem to see a revival of, you know, Christian conservatism. And reading your pages, I thought, I think, he wouldn't probably call it a revival, but maybe more of an appearance of it. So could you tell us more?
Sure. I mean, I am concerned about those who latch onto Christianity because of its cultural effects. I I do believe Christianity has a good effect on the culture, but it has a good effect on the culture because it's true. It isn't true because it has a good effect on the culture. And that would be where, I hated to do this because I love his writings, but that was where I was somewhat critical of Roger Scruton, because I often felt reading him that God was a great idea because it supported his notion of the sacred and supported his aesthetics and his moral vision of the universe. He was less clear on whether God actually existed or not. And I think that's problematic. And I worry that in an era of deep cultural and social division, Christianity might become an idiom for expressing almost exclusively political ambitions. And that, I think, is a danger. Now, having said that, I think if that's the reason why more people start attending church and hearing the truth, seeing the sacrament celebrated, getting drawn in, then that's a stepping stone towards a good thing. They may well find, and I think we're seeing this with the number of high-profile intellectuals who returned to attending church because they were looking for something solid to ground their cultural opinions, and they've actually been drawn to a much deeper understanding of the claims and the challenges of Christianity. So I do think it's this time of whether you want to call it a revival, a resurgence, or renewed interest. It's not something to be cynically dismissed. I think we have to wait and see to see what the long-lasting effects of it are, and we need to pray that in any individual case, what these visitors to churches or readers of Christian books hear, see, read, will have a transformative effect upon their hearts.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. I just like how you pointed out because I think it might help us understand why, I could think, of people attracted to the liturgy, to the Gregorian chant, to the
Yeah,
incense, and like, but then when faith becomes demanding, when faith becomes, this is something really you have to change in your life. It's not about the way you dress,
yeah,
um, or what kind of, church you go to. Then there's either abandoning or changing or like switching to another church, looking for another option. So I think that this might help us understand, that sometime it's not truly, as you say, it's more a political or like a need. Maybe in a time of
yeah,
big loneliness, there might be just like a need of belonging,
yeah.
which people can find in different places. But so you do talk of Scruton, Roger Scruton, when you talk about people that might just be attracted by the cold side, the liturgy, the beauty, and like might elevate you. And I also like that you used Dawkins to talk about instead the code, right? The What did you mean by code?
Code it's a very broad term, effectively meaning how you think and live outside of church. So at its broadest, it refers to the values you have, how you look at the world. I'm thinking of Richard Dawkins, his return to, or his comments about being a cultural Christian were really in the context of him, I think, immediately worrying about what was being lost in English culture with what's going on at the moment, but also perhaps at a deeper level, his desire to defend what he would see as scientific truth, particularly the distinction between men and women as
Mhm.
biologically grounded. Uh, so for him, when I'm thinking of code in his terms, it's not just how you behave, but perhaps what might be described as a sort of worldview or the some of the accompaniments of worldview.
And I think it was very clear to me when you said, why should biology? Because what you say about Dawkins is like, why should biology be normative, right? Because if as a scientist you say, well, but there is a biological difference between male and females, but then yeah, but it's because you have an idea of like our capacities and our limits and the way we can interact even with our biology that you think that that's relevant. Because otherwise, I would agree with you. If the creed is not there, then why should biology something be something where it would be a place where we'd stop it. So in a way, being radically desecrating to me in today's word sounds a lot more reasonable than setting some, very arbitrary lines like, oh, no cloning. Well, why?
Yeah.
Like you do if you do experiments or like gene editing, like why not cloning? Um so in order to find these limits again and to in order to understand what the human person is. I know that you talk about God, but if we were to say, is there any way outside, of the Bible for people that are just like, I can't start from the Bible, give me something else that I
Yeah,
can start
yeah.
from?
Yeah, well, certainly there are many who've tried to do that. I'm currently reading the German philosopher Hans Jonas, who
Mhm.
really attempts to. I think Jonas himself was. I think he was ethnically Jewish, but I think he was an atheist or maybe an agnostic. But certainly, God as a metaphysical reality doesn't play in his thinking. But he was aware way back in the sort of 1960s through the 1980s that technology was fundamentally changing how we thought about human nature. He sees particularly the development of things like genetics as that's different to the steam engine. The steam engine gets bodies from one place to another quicker, and that's huge. But things like genetic engineering actually start to change who we are at our deepest level. And he's aware of that problem. So he's wrestling with how can I put guardrails in place? How can I produce norms? And he has much to say about we would say teleology. And he really tries to argue that the body itself carries its own kind of teleology. I mean, I might say if you're asking me to make a rationalist defense of bodily teleology, I'd say, well, look at every creature on the face of the earth. We all We all need to replace calories. We all need to reproduce our own species. Maybe that's an inherent teleology that we all possess, and that's something that we could then build on to provide guardrails. So I'm not brilliant enough to anticipate that that's a completely blind alley project. It seems to me to be a very complicated and difficult one. It does seem to me that, by and large, the issue is: do you believe in God? Do human beings, are we made in His image? Do we have a teleology that's given to us by God, or do we need to accept the challenge of the madman and create our own values and our own ends?
Yeah, and somehow there's just simply nothing in between, right?
Yeah,
It either is or isn't. But like you can say, well, it's a little bit, or it's when we need to. I must say, you have a lot of interesting chapters. Of course, there's the one you talk a lot about sex and the pornographic culture. I think that's what's very interesting about that, and the way you talk about it is also how after the sexual revolution, something not only our mores have changed, but and this is part of something that would like for you to expand on. Sex is not anymore something we do, but is something we are.
yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that's something I explore in my earlier work as well, where I think Sigmund Freud is fundamental here. And Freud really, he's the guy who, in his three essays on sexuality, he produces this taxonomy of growing up from being an infant to being an old age pensioner. And the thing that he sees as definitive of each period of our lives is the nature and direction of our sexual desire. So what he's doing in those essays is really saying that the fundamental continuity between infancy and old age, the thing that makes you you, is the sexual desire that you have. And when you think about that, what he's doing there is he's emphasizing desire, not activity. Freud is really claiming that you could be a lifelong celibate. You could never have a sexual experience in your life, but the thing that has defined you is your sexual desire. So he shifts the thinking about sex away from acts we perform to the nature of the desires we have. If listeners say, if you look at if you were to pick up a Bible and read the Old Testament of the Bible, or if you're Jewish, you pick up the law and you look at the law, you'd see that there's a lot of do's and don'ts, primarily don'ts, but there's a lot of do's and don'ts about sexual behavior. But it's all about behavior. You can do this thing, you can't do that. That's not what Freud is zeroing in on, and his understanding has become the common intuition of our day. If you were to ask somebody, are you gay or straight? One, they'd almost certainly understand what you're asking. And two, they would likely answer that question without any reference to particular sexual activity they've engaged in. Some years ago, I had a conversation after I did a Sunday school at a church with a young man. I think he was 12 or 13, and he came up to me afterwards and he said, I used to be bisexual, but now I'm straight because it wasn't working for me. And I said, well, that's interesting. And we got into a conversation about it, and it became very clear to me that this young man had never had a sexual relationship. He was simply talking about his identity in terms of feelings that he had. And of course, Freud's theory, I think, has a certain plausibility to it on the grounds that we know that sexual desire is a hardy perennial and a powerful force throughout human history. The example I use in class to demonstrate this, I say, we read the Iliad today and we know what it's about. It's about a guy whose wife runs off with some other guy. And we know that that's serious. Why do we know it's serious? Because we know something of the power of sexual desire and the destructive nature of sexual desire from our own experience. We've not grown up in Mycenae in 750 BC, but we can identify with what's being described there because it's touching on something powerful. So Freud, in many ways, he's grabbing hold of something that, yes, has a plausibility to it, even if he takes it in directions that are problematic.
Yeah, what I'm thinking, is the amount of people that describe themselves in their later life now as asexual, but say lesbian, a woman. So, proving your point, like this is more like in terms of desire. And I would agree with you that desire is something that is perennial and is there, but desire can be shaped, right? And so
Yeah.
knowing what is the prevalence of, the images that you can find online and the kind of
Yeah.
actions that can be performed, you might start to think that that you are something because of
Yes.
the development of certain desires that in reality are just a product of things that you watched and that aroused you. The thing that is interesting to me is that you say because things are now this way, that's why people feel the need of fighting outside limits because they're actually not just limiting their behavior, but they're affecting their own identity, right? Their
Yeah.
existence.
Yeah. Yes, if as we're all taught these days, if we are our feelings, then anything that inhibits our expression of those feelings is an inhibiting of our very selves. So, for the person who feels attracted to people of the same sex, for them not to be able to act out on that is a denial of who they really are. So very powerful. And I would add a bodily component to that. Again, I would, to bring the desecration aspect in, I would say it's interesting that a lot of these sexual identities and actions involve a denial of the teleology of the human body.
Yeah.
Uh, Men and women are designed to be joined together in some
Mm,
ways. Men and men are not designed to be
mm,
joined together in particular ways. So there is a teleological aspect to this. For me to engage in sexual libertinism is for me to deny that I've been given a
mm,
teleology by God. It is
mm,
a desecration of my body, and it's the killing of God, to use Nietzschean
mm.
terminology.
And I would say, something that probably our audience already heard, and I would assume, most of the people that have written on this topic would agree on, is that once you make sex sterile, it doesn't really matter with whom you have, you perform it. It's once you've taken away its teleology, then anything goes, because it's just become a meaningless act. Um, Taken away. Now, what is interesting also is that you say, yeah, identity is extremely important. At the same time, and maybe speaking of some incoherence and contradictions that are usually not sign of truth, but of its enemy. Um, you point out how the LGBTQ groups were the same ones protesting Israel, which is actually the only country in the Middle East where they would be free to live their sexuality. And in favor of Islamic countries. So that sense you talk of transgression as having
Yeah.
being the distinctive reason for that.
Yes, I think the question is, what do Hamas and you know the LGBTQ alliance in America, what do they have in common? I think they don't share any positive vision.
Mm,
Clearly, a religiously fundamentalist terrorist group doesn't share a lot in common with Ivy League educated gender theorists. There's just not a lot of positive shared space there, if any at all. What they do share in common, though, is a repudiation, we would say, of everything the West stands for. And I would perhaps narrow it and say a repudiation of uh, fundamental humanity. They're united by this spirit of, I borrow the term from Goethe. They're united by this spirit of negation, this need to tear down everything that asserts itself. And when you think of that, that's the ultimate transgression. The thing about the world in which we live is that as soon as one category is transgressed and replaced by another category, that new category becomes potentially oppressive. And I think of the fate of those LGB activists who campaigned so vigorously for gay marriage. a transgressive campaign in many ways, who now find themselves on the wrong side of the current progressive consensus because they are not on board with the transgender agenda. They become transphobes. And it's a great example of how, as soon as you establish a category, it has to be torn down.
Yeah. I can't but nod, and I hope that that's also the reaction that our audience is having. One thing that to me is kind of positive, and I don't know if you agree, but, in talking about your desecration and the need to consecrate ourselves again in a way, right? Understanding ourselves as part of a bigger order, if we want to phrase it that way, and as a bigger picture that includes us all and our neighbors that think differently from us. So, we're all included in this, all humanity, not only those who believe so, right? It's gonna be universal necessarily when there is. So the positive thing that I was thinking is that it's maybe correlated to the negative, is that on one hand, I think that the anger comes when you desecrate, and it would be really hard for people to repent. I think it was Pope Leo a couple of weeks ago said, like how rare is for an adult to repent. At the same time, the positive outlook I have is that just like with when Jesus came and like it was very hard to convince the Pharisees, but it wasn't that hard to convince the pagans. So somehow I would think, if I was now 16, 18, 20, starting to figure out, what is even the purpose of studying, building a house, buying a house, getting married, getting sick eventually, like, because, there's not only the pars construens, there's also like at some point, things also start going down. Like, in a way, I think that this reconsecration, instead of calling it re-enchantment, because we've decided that's not the word we want to use, but like that this reconsecration might actually be easier.
I think so. It's interesting. I'm at Notre Dame this year, and I think Notre Dame is welcoming in a record number of students who are either returning to the church of their childhood or are professing Catholicism for the first time. That's not unique to Notre Dame. It seems to be happening in a lot of places around the country, a lot of Catholic institutions around the country. I was at a university in Kentucky a couple of years ago, just happened to be there to do a seminar on a day that what they called a revival broke out. The chapel was full 24 hours a day with young people hearing the word being spoken, hearing the Bible being read. I do think we live at a time where the bankruptcy of
Mm.
the modern liberal West is becoming obvious, at least for the moment, to a rising generation. Now, again, it may not last, it may not strike deep roots, but I do think we have an opportunity at this point to speak into places and to people that we would not have been able to do 20 years ago. You mentioned the trigonometry podcast earlier on. The two guys on the trigonometry podcast, when they interviewed me a few years ago, and led off with that question, is it possible to have a moral universe without believing in God? If I'd been on that podcast 10 years ago, I'd have assumed that question was a gotcha, and they were setting me up to mock me. They're actually, they weren't Christian guys. I don't know where they are now, but they weren't Christian guys at the time. But it was a genuine question. I remember thinking, this is interesting that people thinking seriously about the culture are asking serious questions about metaphysics. And then some of them are taking the next step and asking serious questions about the religion that grounds those metaphysics. So I do think we live at a time where there is a great opportunity. If it goes nowhere, let it not be because we missed the opportunity.
I completely agree. If that's one thing that makes me wake up every morning and say, do it again, or like non-self-censor yourself. Don't stop inviting people to read something you just read or to think about something they haven't thought about. And one thing, Jordan Peterson's, you mentioned him, in his search for God, like we who wrestle with God. Maybe I'm expecting too much from humanity, but I think that if where we're not distracted, we all would wrestle with God and look for
Yeah.
answers. The problem is that we're constantly distracted by a million things that keep us, watching the lights and like not realizing that we are wasting time and maybe pursuing things that are not really that meaningful or like, I know a lot of women my age are like filling their faces with a lot of stuff to look young, and you talk about that too. It's like, is that really money well spent? I do want to ask you one last thing, which has less to do with the book, which I highly recommend, and that I think our young professional, well, not only young, all the professionals are going to read. So you're going to be, at the institute in a way, in spirit, for a while, because it's going to be adopted by our group. But there was something you told me when we last talked that I think is a message that you have in Strange New World that young people probably need to hear all the time. And it had to do with the freedom that comes from closing doors. Um, yeah, would you say that the way you say it, because I think it's much better than the way I
Yeah,
tried to
I can't
paraphrase it?
remember the way I said it to you, Mariana. I do remember the sentiment. I mean, the idea is, if we're not autonomous, free-floating individuals, if we are actually those who are built to be in relationship, if we have natural relationships that bring obligations and we enter into other relationships that bring obligations and relationships that allow us to know who we are, then entering into and cementing those relationships early is a good thing. Closing doors so that you know where you are and where you are standing, that's critical. I've been happily married now for, I think, 35, coming up 36 years. And I've often said to my students, if anything happened to my wife, I would no longer be the person that I am. It's hard for me to think of myself as an individual now. I'm a husband. I'm a father. I am absolutely defined by the relationships, the obligations, the dependencies that I have. And I wouldn't change that for the world. I dread the day if and when that ceases to be. So I would say to young people, commit, close doors, commit yourself, because that's the way of finding a solid place to stand and a solid place to know who you are. I don't know if that's how I expressed it to you last time,
You did,
Marianne,
you
but does
did,
that
you did. I
capture it?
love it. I love it just as much as I loved it last time, and I wish someone would
Uh,
tell instead of, the mantra of like keep your options open. No,
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 no, don't,
no.
no.
Marry young,
Oh,
have children. That's my advice.
pick a career, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well, Carl, I this was delightful. Thank you for your time. The link to your new books, I think, can already be pre-ordered. If by the time this podcast goes out, is not already available, it can always be pre-ordered. But thank you for your time, and I do look forward to having you back in person in Austin soon.
Sounds good.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'm actually down at the end of August.
Okay,
So
we'll be here.
I'm
We'll put a note on our
doing the
calendars.
First Things lecture again. So I'll be flying in
Oh,
on the
okay,
Sunday and leaving on the,
okay,
the Tuesday. So maybe
okay, okay.
lunch on the Monday or something. I think Katrina will
That
probably
would
be
be
with me.
lovely.
So
Yes.
I'll let you
Yes.
know when I'm around. We'll try to get
Perfect.
together.
Perfect.
So
Thank you very much. Thank you, Carl. Talk soon.
good to see you. See you.
Good to see you. Bye. Thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we enjoyed recording it for you. Stay tuned for the next one. Subscribe to the show, suggest it to your friends, and make sure that if you are in Austin and you can attend one of our events, that you show up. We're going to be waiting for you. Thank you.